All right, so today we're talking about the topic of how did European society change in the post-war era. So we were talking in class about government and the new government political parties that have been beginning to develop in Europe after World War II, and now we're going to just talk about how society changed. So the first question we'll talk about is how did the social structure in Europe change? Now, after the war, the face of the middle class began to change. The old middle class was considered basically your doctors, your lawyers, your professors, your businessmen, and now we start to see new managers and technicians and large companies and agencies that begin to develop into like a middle class. Also, those people who had skill-based jobs wanted their children to go to school so that their children then could kind of jump up into the middle class. We also see a shift in the lower middle class during this time period. And a movement from rural to urban areas because the number of agricultural workers declined as we start to see more mechanization of agriculture, but the number of industrial workers remained the same. So in West Germany, for instance, the industrial workers made up about 48% of the labor force, but that began to decrease in the 50s and 60s while white-collar and service jobs began to increase. White-collar jobs are considered more professional jobs that require more education. Jobs that you would wear a suit to are considered white-collar jobs as opposed to blue-collar jobs, which are jobs that you consider jobs that work more with your hands, more jobs that require more of a trade, jobs that require you to wear a uniform would be considered more blue-collar jobs. So in the 50s and 60s, like I said, the white-collar service jobs began to increase in West Germany. We also see an increase in real wages. And as a result, what I mean by real wages is that they could actually spend, it's not that there was inflation and wages run up and then that means that your wages really don't get you any more purchasing power. And the working class really begins to aspire to the consumption patterns of the middle class. They want to have all the stuff that the middle class has, and we start to see a consumer society. And that really is able to happen because in 1948 we start to see the creation, not 1948, but we start to see the creation of installment plan buying, being able to pay things off in smaller chunks over time. So for instance, in 1948 there were 5 million cars. By the 1960s there was 45 million cars in West Germany. So we start to see rising incomes, the cars in Europe in general. We start to see rising incomes, shorter working hours, and more of a market for leisure activities because people aren't working all the time. Between 1900 and 1960, the work week was reduced from 60 hours to 40 hours a week. Paid holidays increase. For instance, in Italy, the average worker gets between 32 and 35 paid holidays a year. So again, this creates an industry of leisure time. Music and sports and media became commercialized, and we see the growth of mass tourism. So in the mid-1960s, you had 100 million tourists traveling around Europe each year. It wasn't just people from outside Europe coming to visit. It was Europeans themselves going and traveling to other parts of the continent. So that takes us to the second question. Did the creation of the social welfare state improve Europe's standard of living? Improve the European standard of living. So we read Great Britain plans a welfare state. So we talked about that in class already. The goal of the welfare state is to make it possible for people to live better and more meaningful lives. The idea is to eliminate poverty, eliminate homelessness by providing medical services, dignity for the elderly, and extending education to all who want it. This way you kind of let people be free to achieve happiness. The goal is to try to lessen the gap between the rich and the poor. And these really began in the late 19th century. We start to see social welfare programs extend to the people. And it started out by creating medical care, old age pensions, family allowances were instituted to provide some sort of level of child care. Also, we start to see the number of universities begin to expand and scholarship aid, the idea so that everyone could go to college. In the early 1960s in Europe, most university students were from privileged families, wealthy families, but now we start to see more students from the middle class, lower classes being able to go to college because the cost of university fees were going down. And so the states had to expand the amount of money spent on social services. So in 1967, about 17% of the GNP, or the gross national product, went towards social services. By the 1980s, it was between 40 and 50%. And this is going to be where you see the largest criticism against these social welfare programs, because it creates, some critics will say that it creates citizens that are overly dependent on the state. And basically, once you have them in place, it's really, really difficult to reform them or change them, because basically it'd be political suicide to speak against them, because they are relatively popular amongst the people, and then to make any changes to fix them, basically is going to get you voted out of office. There also was a question with the social welfare state as to how women should be treated. In Britain and Germany, the question was, should mothers be given special treatment? The welfare system, the welfare state, was kind of based on the belief that women should stay home with children, with their children. So women would receive subsidies once they had children. Married women who worked received little or no benefits from the social welfare state, and this was done on purpose to encourage women to stay at home. And basically, it also encouraged women to be paid less. And this was different from the communist countries in Eastern Europe, because women were encouraged to work, and they were given benefits to help raise their families and to work outside the home. In France, women were recognized as equal to men, but they were given incentives to stay at home. So that takes us to the next question, basically, is, did women's positions change in the post-war world? So even though I know this is a picture from Washington, D.C., but did women change in the post-war world? So women were removed from the workforce at the end of the war, because all these soldiers returning home, and the governments and workers wanted to make sure that the soldiers had jobs as they returned home. We also see right after World War II a baby boom. Birth rates rose in the very quick fashion, but it didn't last. By the end of the 1950s, the size of families began to decline again. And a couple of things kind of played into that. The first was the practice of birth control. So in the 19th century, we see the use of condoms, and then in the 1960s, we see the introduction of the birth control pill. And that really changed women's lives in a big way, because it allowed women to have a greater say in when they were going to begin to have children and to engage in family planning. So as a result, it changed women's employment, because women were going to have more years where they were not raising children, because they could limit the number of children that they were having. So that meant that there was more time for them to be working. So we do see an increased number of married women entering into the workforce. Despite that, though, they still earned lower salaries for equal work. In the 1960s, British women received about 60% of men's wages. So for every dollar a man made, a woman made 60 cents. In France, it was 50%, and in Germany, it was 63%. Women were still very much limited in what kind of jobs that were available to them, and they still had the responsibility of taking care of the home. So they were still the primary person doing all the chores at home. In Sweden, in Great Britain, in Germany, Poland, Hungary, Austria, Czechoslovakia, all these countries granted women the right to vote in 1918. So Sweden, Great Britain, Germany, Poland, Hungary, Austria, and Czechoslovakia, they all granted women the right to vote in 1918. In the U.S., women got the right to vote in 1920. In Italy and France, they didn't get the right to vote until 1945, which is kind of crazy. Basically, by the late 1960s, women began to assert their rights and begin to speak out as feminists. And they began to protest the lack of true equality that women were having with men. One woman in particular, Simone de Beauvoir, we're going to read from her in class. I will try to write her name, but I can't guarantee anything because we don't know if my pen's working. Nothing's working right now, so yeah, it's not going to let me write it. But Simone de Beauvoir, she's on the list, so go check your list. She was from a Catholic middle-class family. She was educated at the Sorbonne. The Sorbonne is the University of Paris. It's like the Harvard, or Paris. It's like the Harvard of France. Basically, really, it's pretty much more like Harvard is the Sorbonne of the U.S., kind of, because Sorbonne has been around much longer. She was a teacher, a novelist, a writer, and she was involved with a lifelong relationship with a man, but she chose to never get married because she believed that women faced limits that men did not. She wrote a book called The Second Sex, and she felt that this was a result of male-dominated societies. Women were defined by their differences from men and got second-class statuses as a result, which is why she chose not to marry her longtime partner. Another famous feminist, she's actually from the U.S., Betty Friedan. She wrote The Feminist Mystique. She was a journalist and a mother of three. and she was very uneasy with the role that she played as the traditional housewife and mother. So she wrote The Feminine Mystique to talk about why women were being denied equality with men, and because they were being denied equality with men, they were being kept from growing into their full capacities. In 1966, we see the organization now, the National Organization of Women, which was purpose was to bring women into full participation of society. So we start to see women beginning to kind of find their voice and speak out and demand more rights. So the next question. Why was the period after World War II known as the permissive society? So you can kind of imagine how relieved everyone must have felt after World War II. You know, the stress of living under another world war. We see this also after World War I. So in the 1920s, there was a lot of experimentation with drugs in Europe. There was the appearance of pornography. There was a great deal of new sexual freedom. If you think like the 20s and the flappers and all those types of things, and the short skirts and the short hair. This was only, though, in major cities, and it only impacted a small number of the population. But we see this in a much bigger way after World War II. So Sweden actually took the lead in the sexual revolution of the 1960s. Sex education was encouraged in school. The Swedes decriminalized homosexuality, and they introduced the birth control pill. And so these subjects that would have previously been kind of hidden became the subjects of plays and movies and books, and became discussed more and more out in the open. New attitudes basically then began to cause breakdowns in traditional families. So for instance, in the 1960s, divorce rates increased dramatically, where previously the thought was that divorce was very taboo and you never got divorced. You just kind of dealt with it. In the 1960s, we start to see divorce increase dramatically. We also start to see premarital and extramarital sexual experiences increase. So extramarital would be like an affair. So in the Netherlands in 1968, 78% of men and 86% of women admitted to having an affair. In the 1960s, we also see the emergence of a drug culture. Think about the 1960s in our own country. It's considered to be this very kind of like liberal, hippie, free love type of idea, and the same type of attitudes were permeating in Europe in the 1960s. So marijuana was something that was used widely amongst college and university students, and we start to see wide-scale use of other drugs like LSD. So the next question, or the last question for this topic, is why did the 1960s see students revolting? Before World War II, like I said before, higher education was really for only the upper classes. After the war, the fees were reduced, and universities gained a huge influx of students from the middle and lower classes. So in France, in 1950, for instance, 4.5% of the population attended university. By 1965, it was 14.5%. So it's a huge increase. So this rise in enrollment created a lot of problems. The classrooms were overcrowded with too many students. The professors didn't really pay much attention to their students because there was just so many of them. The administration acted very authoritatively, and that led to a lot of student resentment. And students felt that they were not being taught things that applied to them today. They thought the curriculum was very antiquated. And so this discontent led to an outbreak of a bunch of student revolts. And it was an extension of some of the spontaneous disruptions in U.S. universities kind of sparked by discontent with the Vietnam War. So these two movements are kind of linked. It was a desire to reform the university. They also attacked Western materialism because they felt the world was becoming too impersonal. If you look at this newspaper, you also see this is the Columbia Student Strike Coordinating Committee to support the French workers and students. So we see this connection between universities here in the United States and what was going on in Paris. In addition, there was a coalition between the Parisian students and French workers, and those two events kind of like joined into one big movement. So the most famous revolt occurred in Paris, France, in 1968. It began originally in a university, the University of Nanterre, outside of Paris, and then spread to the Sorbonne. And basically it was attacking Western imperialism. Students demanded greater voices in the administration of the university, and they began to take over buildings. They invited the workers to support them, and about half of France's workforce went on strike. And you could see what one of these protests looked like. And Charles de Gaulle's government granted a large wage hike which then kind of like cut the fire out from the workers, because they were like, all right, great, we got more money, we're happy. So they returned to work, and the police was able to repress the remaining protesters. But here we can see this is some of the graffiti that the protesters wrote, that the students wrote. And you can see that it's kind of very anti-capitalism, anti-materialism. This idea of a world where everyone is just kind of mindless workers, commute work, commute sleep. We don't want a world where the guarantee of not dying of starvation brings the risk of dying of boredom. And we see here some more of these things. Barricades close the streets but open the way. A proletarian who's someone who has no power over his life and knows that, remember, a proletarian is a worker. And so here you can see some of the propaganda again revealed. This is Charles de Gaulle is always shown with this like tiny hat on his head and that very exaggerated nose. So this says "Be young and quiet," which is a variation on the more common, classically sexist version of "Just sit there and look pretty." And there's another image of de Gaulle kind of crushing the people, and the people kind of turning up and trying to silence de Gaulle after being silenced. They felt being silenced by him. So you could see protesters on the street and the riot police coming after them. Now, the French love to build barricades. Napoleon III actually tears down most of Paris and rebuilds it to have these wider streets and boulevards, so it makes it more difficult for these barricades to be built. But we can see that these students were very ingenious and they found other ways to build barricades. Let me see here some more. This photograph actually showed up on a AP European History essay question one year, contrasting it with pictures of the Hitler Youth to see like what difference between student movements. Now, basically, this movement eventually ends because the police was able to repress the remaining protesters after the workers kind of stopped the fight. The French Revolt did spur student protests in other countries in Europe, but not to the degree in France. So in West Berlin, university students led a protest against the leader of Germany's largest newspaper. They wanted to disrupt the old order. Basically, though, the Berliners supported the police repression of the students rather than the students fighting against the, oppressed, rather than the students fighting as the oppressed masses. So people weren't really willing to support this type of uprisings in other parts of Europe. So that takes us to this question: how has Europe changed from World War II until 1970? So I want you to think about that, and we'll talk about it in class.